For a long time my family called me a failure. Someone with no future, no worth. I carried the weight of that silent pain while trying to understand who I really was. Until, in an unexpected moment, the governor looked me in the eyes and said, "You are the chosen one." That phrase changed everything. It was the beginning of a journey to uncover secrets my family had hidden for years, to confront lies, rediscover who I truly am, and learn that forgiveness is the key to freedom. This is my story, a story of pain, struggle, and, above all, transformation. Prepare yourself to learn the truth no one ever expected. The house of my childhood always had a strange silence, not a peaceful one, but one full of tension. As if the walls listened to everything, as if something was being hidden in every corner. My father, or the man I thought was my father, was a stern man. Not in the classic sense of shouting or hitting. He was the kind of man who destroyed you with silence. One look from him was enough to make me shrink inside. I grew up trying to earn the love he never spoke aloud. I grew up believing that I had to struggle just to be seen. There was one rule I never understood. We were not allowed to touch the painting in the dining room. An old black and white portrait of a young woman with sad eyes. We never asked who she was. He never explained. One day I tried to touch the frame and he grabbed my arm so hard I had bruises for days. I was 7 years old. My mother, she was a shadow. A faded woman. Someone who walked around the house as if she was always apologizing for existing. She loved me, of that I'm sure. But it was a love bound by fear. And that fear had a name and a face. The man we all called father. From the outside, our family was the perfect picture. My father was a well-known merchant in town. He attended church every Sunday, helped with charity events. The sort of man everyone respected. I even felt guilty for not being able to love him the way I thought I should. It was only when he became ill many years later that I began to understand that the life I had lived was a carefully constructed lie. My father began to wither like a dry branch in midwinter. A man who had always held his shoulders straight and his gaze firm was now breathing with difficulty, dependent on machines, his skin pale and as thin as paper. The diagnosis came fast and cruel: terminal lung cancer. 6 months, maybe less. And as cold as it may sound, I felt nothing at first. No tears. No shock. Just a strange sensation that this was the beginning of something, and not the end. My mother cried silently as always. And I continued visiting out of obligation, saying what a son is expected to say: "Stay strong, Dad. You'll get through this." But he knew he wouldn't. And I did too. By the 3rd week of his hospitalization, he started talking to me more than he ever had. It was as if the physical pain had broken down emotional walls. He started calling me son, with an artificial tenderness, like someone trying to plant flowers in soil they never tended. One gray Tuesday afternoon, I was alone with him in the room. The TV played a silent news broadcast, and the heart monitor beeped rhythmically into the silence. He looked at me with hollow eyes and said something that made me stop breathing for a moment. "I need to tell you something, before it's too late." My instinct was to think about money, a will, perhaps a business secret. But what came next dismantled the world I thought I knew. "I'm not your father." I stayed silent. Not because I doubted what I'd heard, but because my body didn't know how to react. That was not just a sentence. It was a blade piercing the center of my identity. "What?" I managed to murmur, nearly voiceless. He coughed weakly, blood at his lips. His eyes looked at me without emotion, as if telling me they were forecasting rain. "I'm not your biological father. I never was." He sighed, seeming relieved to finally say it. "Your mother. She was already pregnant when we got married." My mind flashed with images. Family gatherings, old photos, his reprimands, the absence of affection. Everything was cruelly falling into place. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" He looked away. For the first time I saw something I never expected in that man. Shame. Because I thought I could pretend. That I could be a father anyway. But every time I looked at you, I saw the face of another man. I didn't know whether to cry, to scream, or to run away. I just sat down, still numb from the revelation. "Who is my father then?" I asked. He closed his eyes. Silence. 4 painfully long seconds. "This is the part that will hurt more than anything." My heart pounded faster. Not from anxiety, but from a silent rage beginning to form. Against him, against my mother, against all the silences accumulated over a lifetime. "Say the name," I said. "I have the right to know." He took a deep breath. He closed his eyes for a few seconds as if the name carried the weight of a sin. His name is Miguel. Silence. I expected thunder. A shock. Something inside me crying, I know that name. But nothing came. Miguel was just a sound lost among many, and that made things even worse. I had no idea who he was. He was an old friend. Of your mother's. There was something poisonous in the way he said friend. The kind of poison that carries resentment, jealousy, and wounded pride that never healed. My father, or better said the man who raised me, had a blurred look and his voice was already failing. I met your mother when she was already 3 months pregnant. I wanted to raise you alone. But I fell in love with her. I accepted it. I wanted to build a life. Pretend I could be your father. And why did you hate me so much? He widened his eyes, surprised by my direct question. He coughed again. A little more blood seeped into the white sheet. I never hated you, he murmured. I just never could forget that you were his. And that was when I understood. He raised me, but he always associated me with betrayal, with the shadow of another man. For years, I was the reflection of a pain he never managed to bury. That night, I left the hospital without saying goodbye. The city felt different. The lights, the sounds, even my own name. Nothing felt truly mine anymore. I wasn't the son of who I believed I was. I didn't know my real father. And worse, my mother had hidden it from me for over 30 years. I walked home even though the hospital was not close. I wanted to feel the ground beneath my feet, to let my legs hurt what was hurting my heart. I passed streets I'd known since childhood, sidewalks where I rode my bike, places once filled with memories. But now everything felt like the set of a made-up life. Every detail of my childhood became tainted by a corrosive question. Was that a lie too? I arrived home and found my mother sitting on the couch, sewing as she always did. It aggravated me. How could she be so calm stitching fabric when my identity was shredded inside? I need to talk to you. Now. She lifted her eyes, and the way they flickered told me everything before any word was spoken. He knew. He always had. And as much as I wanted to scream, a part of me just wanted to understand. He told you, didn't he? She whispered, lowering her head. Yes. That he's not my father. That you were pregnant when you got married. That my real father is called Miguel. She laid the needle in her lap as if it had become unbearably heavy. I wanted to tell you so many times, but I always thought it wasn't the right moment. And then, the fear of losing you became stronger than the truth. Losing me? I laughed dryly. You lost me the day you decided to lie. She began to cry silently, and despite my anger, something inside me ached seeing her like that. Because I knew down deep that she was also a prisoner of that lie. Who is Miguel, Mom? Where is he? I don't know, she answered, her voice faltering. The last time I saw him you weren't even born. He disappeared, Leo. Vanished without explanation. I searched. For months. And then I accepted that he didn't want to know me. Or you. She said my name as if it tasted bitter, as if calling me Leo recalled an open wound that never healed. And Marcos? I asked, using the name of the man who raised me. Did he force you to hide this? She shook her head slowly. No. He knew. From the beginning. And he saved me. When Miguel disappeared, I was alone, pregnant, rejected by my own family. Marcos offered me a home. But he never loved you. He said he did. Said he would try. But every time he saw you, it was as if he saw the face of the man who left me. I fell silent. Inside, a strange mix of gratitude and hatred stirred. Gratitude because that man, whether love or not, gave me a roof. Hatred because he never gave me what mattered most. Love. He raised me with resentment. He taught me to fear, not to love. My voice trembled. And you let it happen. She remained silent, and for the first time I saw my mother small. Not physically but emotionally, as if the entire structure holding her up collapsed before me. I was wrong, son. And I will carry that with me for the rest of my life. I took a deep breath. It wasn't forgiveness yet. Just exhaustion. Exhaustion from not knowing who I was. Exhaustion from living like a piece in the wrong place. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling for hours. I remembered birthdays when Marcos didn't show up. Reprimands over trivial matters. The absence of an "I'm proud of you." How he never called me my son, naturally. It was always Leo, as if I were a tenant in the family. I also remembered a scene that stayed with me. I must have been around 10. We were at school and a classmate fell during recess, getting hurt. When his mother arrived, she ran to him, hugged him on the ground, getting her clothes muddy without hesitation. And I wondered, would my mother do that for me? At the time I thought it was silly. Today I know, it was my body trying to warn me. Something was wrong. Something out of place. The next day I returned to the hospital. Marcos was weaker. His face sunken, his eyes dull. He looked at me as I entered and made a faint gesture with his hand. I sat beside him and remained silent for a while. "Thank you for coming back," he murmured. "I didn't come back for you. I came because I need to understand everything." He took a deep breath, the oxygen mask making his words difficult to hear. "There's a letter. In the back drawer of my office. Inside a red-covered book." I widened my eyes. "A letter. It's from Miguel." He coughed. He wrote to me a few days after disappearing. He explained everything. My heart raced. "And why didn't you show it to me?" "Because, if you knew what he said, maybe you would want to look for him. And I couldn't bear losing you." That was the only time I saw Marcos cry. A single tear, solitary, running down his cheek. It wasn't just guilt. It was fear. Maybe even love. Twisted, poisoned, but still love. In that moment, something inside me broke and rebuilt itself at the same time. He never hugged me. But now I understood why. He couldn't. Because carrying someone else's abandonment, and still trying to be a father, required more courage than I could comprehend. I ran home. I went to his study and found the book, The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky. I never imagined he read anything so heavy. I opened it at the back cover. There was an old envelope with my name handwritten, "For Leonardo. When the time comes." I sat down in the chair. My hands trembled. It was the handwriting of someone I'd never met, but who ran in my veins. I opened the letter. And there the past finally spoke to me. The letter was yellowed with time. The paper, thin, almost translucent in parts, bore fingerprints as if it had been read and reread before being stashed away forever. I opened it delicately as if handling a ghost. And I began to read. "Leonardo, I don't know if you will ever read this. And maybe you shouldn't. But if this has reached you, it's because time has done what it always does. Torn through silences. I am Miguel. The man who put you into this world. And then disappeared from it. I don't want to ask for forgiveness. Nor to justify everything. I only want to tell you what I never had the courage to say. When I met your mother, she was like light after a blackout. I was a broken man without direction, but she made me feel whole. Our love was fast, impulsive, desperate. And like everything that burns too brightly, it didn't last. I learned of the pregnancy. And I fled. Yes, I fled. Cowardly. I thought I wasn't ready to be a father. Or maybe, deep down, I felt unworthy of having a son. For years I lived haunted by this. By the face I never saw. By the babe's cries I never heard. By the first steps I missed. By the daddy I never heard. After a time I tried to return. But I discovered your mother had married. And her husband, Marcos, claimed to be your father. I wanted to appear. To knock on the door. To say who I was. But he found me first. Yes, Marcos sought me out. And we met only once. He told me you were okay. That he would give everything to you. That I would only bring pain and confusion. That if I truly loved you, I should disappear forever. I believed him. Because he spoke with frightening conviction. He didn't sound like a jealous man. He sounded like a man desperate to protect you. And that destroyed me. He asked me to disappear. And I did. Far away. I changed city. Changed life. Never came back. But, Leonardo, I thought of you every day. I saw you in passing children. In birthdays I celebrated alone. In the mirror. And today I write this as a man who lost everything, except the memory of a son he could never hold. With pain and love. When I finished reading, my eyes were full of tears. The shaky handwriting, the raw honesty, it didn't feel like a letter. It felt like a cry for help. I closed my eyes and pictured Miguel. Tall or short? Dark hair like mine? Did he have my smile? My gestures? Or was he someone completely different? I didn't know anything about the man who gave me life. But now I knew he hadn't forgotten me. And that broke me inside. That night I stayed silent. For the first time in years I didn't feel anger toward Marcos. I felt pity. Because he was also afraid. Because he saw a love being born that wasn't his and tried to claim it. But that never works. Love forced is a prison. And I was the prisoner. In the following days, Marcos worsened. The doctors said it was a matter of hours. My mother stayed up nights by his side, holding the hand of the man who loved her in his own way, crooked, silent, but perhaps more genuine than it seemed. On the penultimate day, I entered the room and found them both awake. Marcos, breathing with difficulty, looked at me as if asking forgiveness without words. I approached, sat beside him, took the letter from my pocket and placed it on the sheet. I read it. He closed his eyes. "You were right to hate me," he murmured. "I don't hate you," I replied. "But I don't know if I can forgive you yet." He nodded slightly. "I just want you to find him." I was surprised. "What?" "Go after Miguel. He's your father. You need to know where you came from. Know who you are." Those words, said with so much hardship, seemed the final act of courage from a man who spent his whole life afraid of the truth. The next morning he passed away. There was a deep silence. No machines beeping. No loud weeping. Just the final exhale, and the end of a story full of holes. At the funeral, everyone called him a man of integrity, a good father, an example. I just watched, without interrupting, without correcting, because what others knew was only the surface. After the burial, I went to my mother and said, "I'm going to look for him." She didn't ask whom. She knew exactly who I meant. She handed me an envelope with some old papers. An address in Minas Gerais. A full name, Miguel Farias Duarte. And that's how at 34 years old my life began again. With a road ahead. And a name I had never spoken aloud, but now was part of me. Miguel's letter marked me deeply, but what came next was a chaotic mix of emotions. Anxiety, fear, hope, and an almost desperate urge to understand who I really was. With the address and name in hand, I began preparing my trip to Minas Gerais, the place where, supposedly, my biological father might still be, or not. I knew this meeting could change everything or simply leave me with more questions than answers. But I had to try. For me. For him. For all that was left undone. Before leaving, I spent one last night in the house I grew up in. I looked at the empty room, at the walls that held memories of a boy who always felt out of place. I picked up some old photos, the same ones I'd never really looked at closely before. I saw a picture of me with Marcos, my mother, and a woman I didn't recognize. The woman from the dining room portrait we could never touch. Questions started flooding in, unstoppable. Who is she? Why did they never talk about her? What did my mother know that she never said? The next morning, I had a quick coffee and boarded the bus toward the town on the address. The trip took hours, but time felt eternal. During the ride, memories of my childhood flooded back. The times Marcos was absent. My mother's constant silence. The disapproving looks that carried the weight of the secret. Arriving in the small town, I felt like I'd stepped into a place frozen in time. The streets were narrow, the houses old, and people stared curiously at the stranger who arrived. I looked up the address on the paper. A simple house on the outskirts with a modest garden and a peeling wooden fence. My heart raced. With each step toward the door, a whirlwind of emotions mixed inside me. Fear of rejection, anxiety for answers, hope of finally finding a lost piece of myself. I rang the bell and waited. The door opened slowly. A man with graying hair, a face weathered by time and eyes full of stories looked at me. "Can I help you?" he asked, voice weary. I inhaled deeply and said, "My name is Leonardo. I'm your son." The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to fill the entire space. He looked at me for a long moment, and for the first time I didn't see a stranger, but a man who also carried the weight of my story. "Come in," he said with a slight nod. And so, in that moment, our journey began. As I crossed the threshold, I felt a weight I hadn't known in a long time. The air seemed thick with years of silences and unspoken memories. The house was simple like him, devoid of luxury but clearly lived in. Miguel led me to a small living room, where a worn sofa and a dusty bookshelf shared space with yellowed photographs and old objects. He sat down as though every movement took effort, and looked at me as if trying to decipher who I really was. I stood there, feeling the discomfort of a meeting that seemed inevitable, but which no one knew how to start. After all, how do you explain to someone that they are your child after 34 years? I decided to break the silence. "Why did you disappear?" I asked, voice wavering. He took a deep breath. I didn't know how to be a father, Leonardo. I didn't know how to face it. His voice was hoarse, full of remorse. I had my own demons, and fleeing seemed easier than facing all of this. I wanted to say that it was no excuse, but the words didn't come out. Instead I asked, "What happened after you disappeared?" He closed his eyes for a moment as if reliving that time. "Your mother was left alone trying to raise you with the little she had. I heard about her, about you, through the few people who still kept in touch with me. But guilt, Leonardo, it was crushing. Every day away from you killed me a bit inside." For hours, Miguel shared pieces of a story unknown to me until then. He spoke of his struggles with addiction, hard work, sleepless nights, and a distant but present love in his heart. I listened, absorbing every word, feeling a mix of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't name, maybe the beginnings of forgiveness. By the end of that afternoon, as the sun began to set, I knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey. A journey to rebuild ties severed by choices, fears, and silence. I left his house different from when I entered. No longer just a lost son, but someone beginning to find his place in a larger story. It was then that my mother handed me a box of old keepsakes she'd kept in her wardrobe. Inside were photos, letters, newspaper clippings, and a notebook. A diary of a woman who lived in fear but loved deeply. As I leafed through those pages, I immersed myself in the life of a frightened young woman who endured judgment and abandonment, but never lost hope. The pages revealed secret meetings, nights of anguish, and her constant struggle to protect the child she carried in her womb. Every word written there was a silent scream, a plea for forgiveness for a future she never had the courage to reveal. I cried reading it, not only for her pain but because I finally understood that true love isn't always perfect, and even in the deepest shadows there is light. With that box I began to reconstruct my story. A story full of flaws but also of courage and survival. At that moment I realized that truth didn't have to be perfect to be liberating. When my mother finally gave me that box, a mix of anxiety, fear, and curiosity took over my entire body. The box was wooden, old, with some marks of time and the smell of things stored for decades. Its weight seemed to carry more than just objects. It carried an entire story I was about to uncover. Carefully, I placed the box on the kitchen table, a small space with yellow walls and a window letting in the afternoon sun. I opened the lid slowly, almost as if I were opening a forbidden door. Inside were yellowed photographs, some with curled corners, faded envelopes, and old newspaper clipping, and what caught my attention most, a thick leather-bound notebook with yellowed pages. The diary of someone who endured a life of silences and secrets. I picked it up with trembling hands and began to flip through. The handwriting was delicate, sometimes hurried, but carried a palpable urgency. There was the voice of the woman who was my mother. Not the mother of silence and hidden tears, but the young woman who dreamed, suffered, and fought to give me a future. Throughout those pages she wrote of a forbidden, intense love that consumed her and was ripped away brutally. She described secret encounters, fleeing from the fear of being discovered, and the anguish of carrying a child in a world that seemed unwilling to accept her story. She wrote about Miguel with a passion I never imagined. And yet alongside it there was the fear of losing everything, the fear of judgment, the fear of losing me. In one entry she described the night she discovered she was pregnant, an overwhelming mix of joy and terror. Her words overflowed with the loneliness of a young woman facing a battle she never asked for. As I read, I began to understand her choices. The lies meant to protect, the hidden pain so that I could have a more normal childhood even if full of gaps. Among the letters I found one from Miguel which she kept with love and pain. He apologized, explained his fears, and promised that one day everything would be different. Promises that, unfortunately, never came true. But what touched me most was realizing that despite everything there was love. A love that wasn't perfect but was genuine in the measure it could be. I spent hours reading that diary, immersed in the story of the woman who gave me life, understanding that her past wasn't only shadow but also light. A light I needed to move forward. When I closed the notebook I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was the beginning of my reconstruction, the first step to freeing myself from lies and finding my own truth. In the days after discovering the diary, my mind was busy deciphering every fragment of that story that had been a mystery until then. But it was exploring the letters inside the box that the complexity of my origin began to reveal itself even more intensely. Each letter felt like an unfinished conversation. a dialogue between two lost souls trying to understand the limits of love, responsibility, and fear. Miguel's words carried genuine pain, as if he was writing to himself as much as to my mother. One letter, written a few months after my birth, bore a tone of deep regret. I didn't know how to be the man you needed me to be. I fled not for lack of love but for lack of courage. Fear won before I could even try. The letter continued, revealing a man torn between hope to rebuild his life and the crushing weight of guilt and abandonment. My mother responded with a mix of anger and hope. You may have left, Miguel, but I stayed. Afraid, alone, but resolute to protect what is ours, our child. I want to believe that someday, even from afar, you will understand what we lost. Those letters made me reflect on all the times I felt alone, as if I had been an invisible specter in my own home. Now I understood I wasn't alone in that feeling. They too carried their own prisons. I read about the day my mother decided to tell Marcos about the pregnancy. The anguish in her letter was palpable, as if she were reliving each moment of doubt and pain. The letter spoke of a desperate plea for protection, a plea Marcos accepted, but which also laid the foundation for a relationship full of shadows. As I read, I realized that story was bigger than mine. It was about fear, abandonment, and hope for redemption. And even in the midst of so many wounds, there was a thread of love that never broke. With every letter, my understanding grew, and with it, a determination. I needed to reconcile these stories, even if it meant confronting the ghosts my family hid for so long. From the moment I began opening the pages of that memory box, I felt as if I were entering a parallel universe, a dimension where time seemed to fold in on itself, and the voices of the past whispered insistently, demanding to be heard. Each letter, each photo, each handwritten word was like a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting a face I barely recognized, yet that, in some way, was my own. Bit by bit, I realized my search wasn't just for the truth about my biological father, Miguel, but for all he represented. Impossible love, escape, abandonment, the fear of not being enough. One rainy afternoon, while the sky wept over the city and the raindrops tapped rhythmically on the windows, I sat down with the diary and began to read with renewed attention. The faded ink seemed to tell a story that went beyond the words, a story of pain, hope, crushed dreams, and rebirth. My mother, at that time young and vulnerable, faced not only societal rejection but also the stigma of being pregnant out of wedlock in a small town where secrets rarely stayed hidden. She described meetings with Miguel that were brief yet charged with almost tangible tension. He was a man torn between desire and cowardice, between love and fear. His visits were like sudden storms that left deep marks, but also destruction. I remember her description of one particular night, the night he decided to leave, abandoning not only my mother but the child she was carrying. She wrote, "He looked at me with empty eyes, and at that moment I knew everything was over. Promises were made and broken that night, like sandcastles the sea insists on erasing. When he left, he didn't just take his body away, he took a part of me that never returned." These words struck me with unexpected force. It was as if, by reading those lines, I could feel the weight of that cruel farewell, the silent betrayal that shaped my childhood. I, who had lived for years in the shadow of a man who was never my father, now faced the bare truth. The story of my origin was marked by absences and hard choices, but also by a resilient love that, even in distance, never died. That's when I realized the magnitude of the challenge ahead. It wasn't just about discovering who Miguel was. It was about understanding what he meant to me, to my family, to my own identity. For weeks, I dedicated myself to organizing the documents, researching every name, every address, every clue left in the letters and diary. It felt like assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle, each piece potentially altering the final picture entirely. I met some of my mother's old friends, people who remembered her with affection and sorrow, but who knew little about Miguel. I discovered he had lived in several towns, always trying to start over, but always carrying the burden of his own flight. In one of those conversations, a former neighbor told me a story that cut through my chest. Miguel was a good man but full of fears. He never knew how to deal with what he felt for your mother or for the son he never acknowledged. He tried to run from it all, but he never escaped the guilt. Those words made me reflect on the weight people carry, even when they try to hide their flaws. At the same time, I began to question Marcos, the man who raised me. How many times did he feel threatened by a shadow he could never touch? How many times did he hate himself for trying to be a father and failing? That journey into the past led me through a labyrinth of contradictory emotions. Love and hate, anger and forgiveness, rejection and acceptance. But above all, it taught me that the truth is not a straight line, but a winding road filled with unexpected curves and turns. And I was ready to walk that labyrinth no matter how dark it was. In the days that followed, I found myself immersed in a silent yet urgent investigation that consumed me from the inside. Every morning, before the sun even rose, I was already digging through records, making phone calls, talking to people who might be holding the final pieces of the puzzle. My life became an almost obsessive journey, where past and present intertwined in a dance of painful revelations and fragile hope. One of the first discoveries was my mother's secret diary, revealing a side of her I had never known. The strong woman who faced the world with quiet courage also held deep doubts, fears, and profound suffering. She wrote about sleepless nights, about the anguish of protecting a child alone, about the crushing loneliness only a desperate mother knows. And above all, about the immense love she felt for me, a love that made her fight against prejudice, against judgment, and against her own despair. Her words were so real, so tangible, that I could almost hear her voice whispering between the lines, calling me to understand, to forgive, to move forward. At the same time, Miguel's letters continued to appear like echoes from a divided man. A man who, despite all his flaws, had never stopped feeling a deep connection to me, even if in silence. In one of those letters, he confessed his wish that one day he might look me in the eyes and say everything he never had the courage to say. It felt like a plea, and now I felt it as an invitation to finally close a painful cycle. But it wasn't just the past that challenged me. My own identity began to shift. I, who had always felt like a stranger in my own home, started to understand that my roots were deeper and more complex than I had ever imagined. It was a mixture of stories, of people, of pain and love that made me who I am. Every step I took on this journey brought me closer to myself. In the middle of that storm of revelations, I also had to deal with the open wounds in my relationship with Marcos and my mother. Long conversations, sometimes painful but necessary, helped us begin rebuilding the bonds that time and silence had nearly destroyed. I learned that forgiveness is not a simple act, but a process, one that demands the courage to face the shadows of the past and the humility to accept human imperfection. And so, as I walked through that labyrinth of hidden truths, I began to glimpse the possibility of a new story. A story where pain was no longer the protagonist but only a chapter. Difficult, yes, but overcome. As the weeks passed, the journey became more than a search for answers. It became a voyage of self-discovery. I realized that my parents' stories, their choices, their fears, and their weaknesses were inextricably tied to my own existence. Every secret revealed was a facet of my identity, an understanding that was both painful and freeing. One afternoon, while rereading Miguel's letters, I found a different note. It wasn't a formal letter, but a torn page from a notebook, the handwriting shaky, perhaps written in a moment of despair. Today I dreamed of Leonardo. He's here with me even if I can't touch him. I want to believe that someday we'll be able to make things right. That time can still be our ally and not a relentless enemy. Reading those words brought tears to my eyes. It was proof that, despite the distance and the choices that tore our lives apart, there was an invisible connection that had never broken. On the other hand, I also had to face the consequences of my search. Friends who had never known my story now looked at me differently, and close family members had to learn how to deal with the truth I was bringing to the surface. My relationship with my mother also went through profound transformations. She, who had carried the weight of the secret for so long, could now breathe easier, finally able to share her pain with me. And Marcos, even though distant from many of these discoveries, began to understand that the past could no longer be buried. There were moments of confrontation, harsh words, old wounds reopening, but there was also reconciliation. Because in the end we were all searching for the same thing: peace. This phase of my journey taught me about the complexity of human relationships, about how love can manifest in imperfect ways, and about the power of truth to heal even the deepest wounds. I couldn't change the past, but I could choose how it would shape my future. And no matter how dark and frightening the labyrinth, I was determined to find the way out. As time went on, that search for answers evolved into something greater. A complex reconstruction not just of facts but of who I was. It became a kind of emotional rebirth, where every discovery forced me to reevaluate everything I believed about myself. I discovered that family beyond blood, is made up of the stories we tell and the truths we have the courage to face. Still, the road was far from easy. There were sleepless nights when the weight of everything became unbearable. Repressed memories surfaced, dragging along conflicting emotions: anger, sorrow, regret, and yet, a strange feeling of hope. I remembered the times as a child when I felt an unexplainable emptiness, a loneliness I couldn't describe. Now, with the pieces of the past falling into place, I understood that the void had been the echo of absence and lies. I had a long conversation with my mother about these feelings. Through tears, she admitted that she, too, had suffered with the guilt of not being able to fully protect me from the pain of the truth. "I wanted you to have an easier life," she said during one of those talks. "But I realize now that the truth, no matter how painful, is what sets us free." Those words gave me the strength to keep going. I also faced Marcos during difficult moments. Confronting him about his failures was painful for both of us, but necessary. He never denied his mistakes, and little by little he began to open space for honest dialogue. Through that, I began to understand that life isn't made only of truths or lies, but of nuances, of complex, human, and imperfect choices. And even with all the scars, there was still room for healing. It was during that process that I made a decision that would change everything. I decided to seek out Miguel in person so we could finally talk face to face, not just through letters and memories. That meeting would be my final chance to close that chapter of my life. The decision to look for Miguel personally shook something deep inside me. It felt like I was preparing to face not just him, but all the ghosts that had followed me since childhood. I planned the trip with a mix of anxiety and hope, carrying not only the documents and letters, but also the sincere desire to understand, to forgive, and to find myself. When I finally knocked on his door, I was greeted by an older man with tired eyes, but a light in them, the same light I sensed within me, a connection that couldn't be denied. We sat down to talk, like two strangers carrying an intertwined past and an unfinished story. Miguel spoke about his mistakes, his weaknesses, the weight of guilt that had followed him all these years. He admitted that running away had been the most cowardly act of his life, but fear had taken over him. I shared my pain, my doubts, my resentments. It wasn't easy. There were moments of heavy silence, tears, and even harsh words. But in the midst of that difficult encounter, something began to heal. I realized that love isn't perfect, but it can be transformative. And that the truth, no matter how hard, has the power to set you free. That day, I didn't just meet my biological father. I found a part of myself that had been lost. And finally, I began to feel whole, that I began to realize that true transformation didn't depend only on others. Throughout those pages, she wrote of a forbidden, intense love that consumed her and was ripped away brutally. She described secret encounters, fleeing from the fear of being discovered, and the anguish of carrying a child in a world that seemed unwilling to accept her story. She wrote about Miguel with a passion I never imagined. And yet alongside it, there was the fear of losing everything, the fear of judgment, the fear of losing me. In one entry, she described the night she discovered she was pregnant, an overwhelming mix of joy and terror. Her words overflowed with the loneliness of a young woman facing a battle she never asked for. As I read, I began to understand her choices. The lies meant to protect, the hidden pain so that I could have a more normal childhood, even if full of gaps. Among the letters, I found one from Miguel, which he kept with love and pain. He apologized, explained his fears, and promised that one day everything would be different. Promises that, unfortunately, never came true. But what touched me most was realizing that despite everything, there was love. A love that wasn't perfect but was genuine in the measure it could be. I spent hours reading that diary, immersed in the story of the woman who gave me life, understanding that her past wasn't only shadow but also light. A light I needed to move forward. When I closed the notebook, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was the beginning of my reconstruction, the first step to freeing myself from lies and finding my own truth. In the days after discovering the diary, my mind was busy deciphering every fragment of that story that had been a mystery until then. But it was exploring the letters inside the box that the complexity of my origin began to reveal itself even more intensely. Each letter felt like an unfinished conversation. A dialogue between two lost souls trying to understand the limits of love, responsibility, and fear. Miguel's words carried genuine pain, as if he was writing to himself as much as to my mother. One letter, written a few months after my birth, bore a tone of deep regret. "I didn't know how to be the man you needed me to be. I fled not for lack of love but for lack of courage. Fear won before I could even try. The letter continued, revealing a man torn between hope to rebuild his life and the crushing weight of guilt and abandonment. My mother responded with a mix of anger and hope. You may have left, Miguel, but I stayed. Afraid, alone, but resolute to protect what is ours, our child. I want to believe that someday, even from afar, you will understand what we lost. Those letters made me reflect on all the times I felt alone, as if I had been an invisible specter in my own home. Now I understood I wasn't alone in that feeling. They too carried their own prisons. I read about the day my mother decided to tell Marcos about the pregnancy. The anguish in her letter was palpable, as if she were reliving each moment of doubt and pain. The letter spoke of a desperate plea for protection. A plea Marcos accepted, but which also laid the foundation for a relationship full of shadows. As I read, I realized that story was bigger than mine. It was about fear, abandonment, and hope for redemption. And even in the midst of so many wounds, there was a thread of love that never broke. With every letter, my understanding grew, and with it, a determination. I needed to reconcile these stories, even if it meant confronting the ghosts my family hid for so long. From the moment I began opening the pages of that memory box, I felt as if I were entering a parallel universe, a dimension where time seemed to fold in on itself, and the voices of the past whispered insistently, demanding to be heard. Each letter, each photo, each handwritten word was like a shard of a broken mirror, reflecting a face I barely recognized, yet that, in some way, was my own. Bit by bit, I realized my search wasn't just for the truth about my biological father, Miguel, but for all he represented. Impossible love, escape, abandonment, the fear of not being enough. One rainy afternoon, while the sky wept over the city and the raindrops tapped rhythmically on the windows, I sat down with the diary and began to read with renewed attention. The faded ink seemed to tell a story that went beyond the words. A story of pain, hope, crushed dreams, and rebirth. My mother, at that time young and vulnerable, faced not only societal rejection but also the stigma of being pregnant out of wedlock in a small town where secrets rarely stayed hidden. She described meetings with Miguel that were brief yet charged with almost tangible tension. He was a man torn between desire and cowardice, between love and fear. His visits were like sudden storms that left deep marks, but also destruction. I remember her description of one particular night. The night he decided to leave, abandoning not only my mother but the child she was carrying. She wrote, "He looked at me with empty eyes, and at that moment I knew everything was over. Promises were made and broken that night, like sandcastles the sea insists on erasing. When he left, he didn't just take his body away, he took a part of me that never returned." These words struck me with unexpected force. It was as if, by reading those lines, I could feel the weight of that cruel farewell. The silent betrayal that shaped my childhood. I, who had lived for years in the shadow of a man who was never my father, now faced the bare truth. The story of my origin was marked by absences and hard choices, but also by a resilient love that, even in distance, never died. That's when I realized the magnitude of the challenge ahead. It wasn't just about discovering who Miguel was. It was about understanding what he meant to me, to my family, to my own identity. For weeks, I dedicated myself to organizing the documents, researching every name, every address, every clue left in the letters and diary. It felt like assembling a giant jigsaw puzzle, each piece potentially altering the final picture entirely. I met some of my mother's old friends, people who remembered her with affection and sorrow, but who knew little about Miguel. I discovered he had lived in several towns, always trying to start over, but always carrying the burden of his own flight. In one of those conversations, a former neighbor told me a story that cut through my chest. Miguel was a good man but full of fears. He never knew how to deal with what he felt for your mother or for the son he never acknowledged. He tried to run from it all, but he never escaped the guilt. Those words made me reflect on the weight people carry, even when they try to hide their flaws. At the same time, I began to question Marcos, the man who raised me. How many times did he feel threatened by a shadow he could never touch? How many times did he hate himself for trying to be a father and failing? That journey into the past led me through a labyrinth of contradictory emotions. Love and hate, anger and forgiveness, rejection and acceptance. But above all, it taught me that the truth is not a straight line, but a winding road filled with unexpected curves and turns. And I was ready to walk that labyrinth no matter how dark it was. In the days that followed, I found myself immersed in a silent yet urgent investigation that consumed me from the inside. Every morning before the sun even rose, I was already digging through records, making phone calls, talking to people who might be holding the final pieces of the puzzle. I began to write, putting down everything I felt and thought. Words became both my refuge and my mirror. Writing helped me organize the inner chaos, to give meaning to what once seemed like a tangle of disconnected emotions. I wrote about my pain, my fears, my desires. About the child I once was and the man I was becoming. Over time, I also started to build new stories. I rekindled old friendships, met people who helped me see life with new eyes, and allowed myself to dream again. The family I rebuilt wasn't perfect. Far from it. There were still wounds, scars, and painful memories that needed healing. But there was also love, respect, and a genuine desire to move forward. Forgiveness wasn't a straight line, but an upward spiral, where with each turn I rose a little more above the past. And that's how I discovered true freedom. Not the absence of pain, but the courage to keep going despite it. In the hardest moments, I realized I couldn't carry everything alone. That's when I found in therapy a safe space to collapse, reflect, and rebuild. Each session was a deep dive inside myself, where I confronted old fears and allowed repressed emotions to rise. I learned to name my pain, not to run from suffering, but to accept it as an essential part of healing. Over time, I understood that vulnerability isn't weakness, but rather a profound strength that connects us to our humanity. I also saw the importance of open dialogue with my family. Honest, difficult conversations where long-stifled words were finally spoken. Silence gave way to listening, and little by little, we rebuilt the trust that had once been broken. With Miguel, we began a relationship based on truth and the attempt to build a future together, even if the past could not be erased. He showed a willingness to be part of my life, not as a hero but as a real man with flaws and limitations. My mother, in turn, became a crucial ally, sharing with me her pain and joy, her fears and hopes. Together we found strength to face the pain and resentment that remained. And Marcos, though distant at times, showed his willingness to be part of the family we were rebuilding. Each step was a move toward healing, freedom, and inner peace. Throughout this process, I also learned the importance of cultivating self-love. For years, I carried a deep sense of inadequacy, as if I wasn't worthy of being loved or happy. That inner voice kept me from seeing my own value. With the help of therapy and my family's support, I began to loosen those chains. Every small victory, a joyful moment, a healthy choice, a kind word to myself, became a brick in the construction of solid self-esteem. I started taking better care of myself, setting boundaries, and seeking what truly made me feel well. I came to understand that true freedom starts within, when we choose to accept and love ourselves, imperfections and all. That inner shift echoed across every part of my life. Relationships became healthier, decisions more conscious, and inner peace, once distant, felt real and attainable. During this time, one phrase kept repeating in my mind: "You are not your pain, you are your strength." That message became a mantra that kept pushing me forward, even in the hardest moments. I also found strength in the smallest things: a friend's smile, my mother's embrace, an honest conversation with Miguel. These moments were proof that even in the most difficult stories, light can be found. And so, step by step, I began writing a new chapter in my life. A chapter where the past no longer defined me, but served as the foundation for a future full of possibility. As I reach the end of this journey, I look back and see the distance I've traveled, not just in miles but in feelings, in growth, in lessons learned. That child who once felt lost and rejected now understands that his story isn't defined by absence or mistakes, but by the capacity to resist, to love, and to transform. I learned that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves, a key that opens the door to inner peace. It's not about forgetting what happened or denying the pain, but choosing not to let it control our present or our future. My relationship with my family, though still carrying scars, is now a space of honesty, respect, and affection. We built bridges over the ruins of the past, not to erase everything, but with the sincere intention of moving forward together despite our flaws. Miguel, Marcos, my mother, and I, we are imperfect pieces of a complex puzzle, united by a love that has endured time and hardship. And I finally feel whole. Not because my story is perfect, but because I've embraced it in all its complexity. I am more than a missing father, more than broken expectations, more than the pain I once carried. I am the sum of all my experiences, and that sum is what makes me strong, resilient, and capable of loving deeply. And now, with a lighter heart, I look toward the future with hope, ready to write new chapters, live new stories, and above all, be the best version of myself. This is my truth. The truth that once terrified me, but now sets me free. When I think about everything I've lived through, I remember that life has never been a straight line. It's a tangle of paths, decisions, meetings, and missteps that shape who we are, and who we still might become. After forgiving, reconnecting, and starting to rebuild, I discovered that the real challenge wasn't just facing the past. It was facing the present with the courage to transform the future. The meeting with Miguel, the reconnection with Marcos, and the opening of old family wounds brought to light questions I had never dared to ask. Who am I really? What legacy do I want to leave? How can I free myself from the shadows of the past to fully live in the present? That search led me to question everything. My fears, my beliefs, my desires. In the weeks that followed, I dove into an even deeper inner journey, seeking answers not in letters or conversations, but in the silence of the soul. As the days passed, I began to realize that the weight of my choices wasn't just rooted in the past, but especially in the present. Every decision I made could be a bridge to healing or a wall separating me from peace. It was an intense process of self-knowledge, requiring more courage than I thought I had. Many times I felt my heart tighten, my mind spin, and a desperate urge to run from the feelings that threatened to swallow me. But instead of running, I chose to stay, to face the fear, the insecurity, the emptiness. I surrounded myself with people who truly supported me, those unafraid to hear my doubts and hold my pain. Friends, therapists, family, each of them was a cornerstone in building my new life. During this period, I also began exploring new ways of expressing myself and finding meaning in what I was living. Writing remained a safe harbor, but I also ventured into music, art, and contemplative silence. I discovered that creativity is a powerful way of reframing suffering, of turning pain into beauty, chaos into order. Most importantly, I learned to trust again, not just in others but in myself. Acknowledging my limitations was the first step toward accepting my true strength. It wasn't a grand, unshakable strength, but a quiet, resilient force that helped me rise every time I fell. One of the most transformative moments of this phase was when I decided to revisit the places from my childhood and adolescence. The same spaces that once held memories of pain and absence were now witnesses to my rebirth. I returned to the house where I grew up, a place that seemed frozen in time but now pulsed with the memories I needed to confront. Every corner echoed the past. The empty room I never filled, the living room where silence spoke volumes, the kitchen where quiet dinners taught me to live with emptiness. There, among those time-worn walls, I realized this wasn't just a physical space, but a symbol of both my limitations and my possibilities. I felt the weight of my parents' choices, but also recognized the freedom I had to write my own story. It was a moment of confrontation and inner forgiveness, where I forgave not just them but also myself, for carrying resentments that had kept me from moving forward. I also began creating personal rituals to strengthen my connection to myself and to life. Small daily acts. Meditating, walking in nature, writing in a gratitude journal, practicing self-forgiveness, became part of my routine. These rituals didn't erase the scars, but helped me transform the way I related to them. Over time, I learned that life is a dance between what we can control and what we must learn to accept. And that even in the darkest moments, there's always a chance to find light. In this process of reconstruction, I realized I couldn't simply erase the wounds of the past. I had to learn to live with them, to integrate them into my story without letting them define me. This acceptance was one of the hardest steps, because it meant recognizing that pain was part of who I am, not as a negative mark, but as something that shaped and strengthened me. I understood that true freedom doesn't lie in perfection, but in embracing imperfection with love and compassion. During this time, I also became involved in causes that resonated with my story and values. Helping others going through similar experiences brought me renewed meaning, a purpose beyond myself. I saw that transforming pain into action could be a powerful form of healing, for myself and those around me. I formed bonds with communities that shared my experience, joined support groups, and found in human solidarity an endless source of strength. At the same time, I was careful not to lose myself in the suffering of others, always maintaining a healthy balance between empathy and self-care. It was a constant learning process, a delicate dance between giving and receiving, listening and being heard. As I dove deeper into this new chapter of life, I realized that real transformation wasn't just external, in relationships, choices, or surroundings, but internal above all. I began cultivating emotional discipline, allowing myself to observe my own thoughts without judgment, recognize self-destructive patterns, and choose more conscious responses. It was a process that demanded patience and persistence, because old emotional habits don't vanish overnight. There were setbacks, moments of doubt, even hopelessness. But every time I fell, I got back up stronger. I began celebrating these small victories, recognizing that the healing journey is made of slow but steady steps. During this time, I also deepened my self-understanding through reading, meditation, and reflective writing. Books on psychology, spirituality, and philosophy became constant companions, offering new perspectives on my story and the world around me. Meditation helped quiet the mental noise and find an inner space of peace, even amid emotional storms. And writing continued to be the thread that wove together my scattered thoughts, giving voice to emotions that were often buried. As I reach the end of this chapter in my life, I feel a deep mix of gratitude, humility, and hope. Gratitude for those who stood by me, my mother, Marcos, Miguel, friends, therapists, who, despite their imperfections, contributed to my journey. Humility to accept that life is a continuous process, and that we'll never be fully complete, but always in transformation. And hope, the kind born from knowing that, despite pain and challenges, we can choose to be the authors of our own story. Today I look toward the future with renewed eyes, aware of the shadows that walk with me but also of the light I carry within. I know there will be hard days, moments of doubt and fear, but I also know I have the strength and wisdom to keep going. The story I began to uncover is mine, unique, imperfect, real. And that truth is what sets me free. The silence after that meeting wasn't an ordinary silence. It was a dense silence, as if it had weight. Like every minute passed in silence carried tons of unspoken memories. I returned home with the feeling that life had handed me a key. But not one of those keys that opens peaceful doors. It was a key that allowed me to unlock the forgotten basement of the soul. The place where we keep what hurts so deeply that we pretend it doesn't exist. For days I couldn't sleep. Miguel's face, my biological father's, wouldn't leave my mind. His frailty, the words spoken in a trembling voice, the regret stamped in his eyes. It was as if I could finally see his pain and, in doing so, my own. He didn't try to justify himself. He didn't play the victim. He just confessed that he was afraid, that he ran, that he lied, that he failed. I, in turn, had to face the mirrors he held up to my eyes. Because seeing Miguel there, broken, made me realize how many parts of myself were broken too. And maybe that was the hardest thing to face, the similarity, the genetic mirror, the blood that recognizes itself effortlessly. No matter how much I tried to deny him, a part of me knew there was a bond that no absence could erase. The day after the meeting, my mother called me to talk. For the first time, I felt she was truly willing to listen to me, not as a mother trying to protect her child's pain, but as a woman ready to share her own ghosts. I never wanted it to be this way, Leonardo. I swear to God. I was afraid you'd suffer more than I already was. She sat at the edge of the bed, holding a small wooden box. When she opened it, I saw dozens of letters. Letters I had never seen before. Letters from Miguel. They wrote to each other for years, but my mother never gave them to me. She had kept them all in that box, as if each envelope were a bomb she had to keep sealed to prevent it from destroying the fragile stability we barely pretended to have. He used to write every week at first, then once a month, then only on your birthdays. And I didn't have the courage. I thought keeping them was better than letting you get hurt. I picked up one of the letters. The handwriting was shaky but firm enough to carry pain. He called me my son, even though he had never seen me grow up. He described how he imagined my voice, my habits, my questions. In one of them he wrote, "I wonder if he stays silent when he's sad like I do. If he looks up at the ceiling trying to understand the world when night comes." Reading that felt like being pierced with a spear. Yes, I did exactly that. It was as if he knew me even without knowing me. A kind of recognition that defies time, distance, and even abandonment. I sat there reading letter after letter. Some were wrinkled, others stained with what might have been tears or coffee. Every word shattered me and yet at the same time began to rebuild me. Because there was pain, yes, but also a timid, a shamed love that tried to exist even without a chance to bloom. Why didn't you tell me any of this before? I asked, my voice trembling like a child's. My mother cried. Cried like I had never seen before. Because I loved you so much. I thought keeping you away from the pain was my duty. And I didn't realize I was keeping you from the truth. We sat in silence for hours. Just reading. Just existing. The letters felt like a thread binding us, as if all those hidden words were finally reaching their destination. Later, when I was alone, I opened the final letter, the one he had written just before seeing me in person. It was different. Very short. Only 3 lines. But each of them carried the weight of an entire ocean. If one day I look into your eyes, Leonardo, and you don't recognize me, that's okay. But know that even from afar, you were always my son. At that moment, I cried like a child. Not for the letters. Not for him. But for me. For all the times I had felt empty and hadn't known where that hole came from. For the anger I projected onto Marcos, not knowing another male figure was out there waiting in silence. For the nights I looked in the mirror and wondered if I was enough. The truth is that reunion didn't answer everything. There was still confusion. There was still pain. But something inside me had realigned. For the first time, I wasn't adrift anymore. For the first time, I knew where I came from. In the following weeks, I started to write. It was as if all those letters had awakened in me a desire to tell my own story. Not as revenge. Not as retribution. But as a process of healing. I wrote about my childhood, about Marcos, about my mother, about the fights, the silences, the cold hugs, the broken promises. I wrote about how abandonment can hide even in a home where everyone pretends to love each other. About how growing up without knowing where you come from is like walking in a never-ending maze. But I also wrote about the reunion. About how a single look can say more than years of quiet. About how a simple, "I'm sorry," can rebuild bridges even when everything seems destroyed. Miguel called me a few times after that day. The conversations were still hesitant, heavy with the past. But they held a strange kind of peace. He talked about his regrets and I listened. I spoke of my pain and he tried to understand. We weren't seeking perfection. Just a safe place to land after years of flying in circles. With time, I realized I wasn't looking for a father anymore. I was looking for myself. And finally, I had started to find him.